Hi everyone, it's Sue Cranford from the admission office at Eagle Hill School, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's podcast, which features one of my dear friends and colleagues in the world of independent school education, Elizabeth Hall. Elizabeth is an educational consultant, and at Eagle Hill we work with a group of educational consultants who are really terrific professionals who really their mission is to help families find the school that will be the right fit. And Elizabeth founded her firm, which is Hall Educational Resources, which specializes in helping students with learning differences. Elizabeth works with only a limited number of clients each year because she wants to really develop strong and meaningful relationships with all of her clients. She also has wonderful relationships with admission offices like ours. I am so excited for you to get to know her and to learn a little bit more about what she does and also a little bit more about Eagle Hill. So welcome to Elizabeth, and I hope you enjoy our podcast today. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you?
Good. How are you, Sue?
I'm good. I'm so glad to have you here today, and welcome to the Eagle Hill podcast. And I know our listeners are going to be so happy to hear what you have to say and get to know you. So as I said, Elizabeth is a professional educational consultant. And so I thought maybe first we could really educate our listeners as to what an educational consultant is and how did you end up becoming an educational consultant?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect and share. I love helping families and parents, and that's a big part of why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I guess to answer the question, how I got into educational consulting, I started my firm, Hall Educational Resources, 13 years ago. And the reason why I started doing what I'm doing and helping families is because I have 3 kids of my own. And my 2 older children, when they were younger, my son in particular diagnosed early intervention for speech and language services. And then my daughter, when she was in kindergarten, I was questioning if she could be dyslexic. And so I navigated a lot as a parent in terms of their learning needs. And back then, I wish I had known that educational consultants existed, and I didn't know anything about them. And I just jumped right in kind of head first and learned as much as I could to be able to advocate and help my own kids and identify the needs that they had and resources to help them. And so what wound up happening was over and over, my name would be passed to, it was usually a mom who I didn't know, and in most cases had a son who had been diagnosed with dyslexia. And I would come home from my job at the time and get home and kind of get my kids settled and into bed. And then I'd go off to the local Starbucks and meet this mom who I didn't know, who had gotten my name, and help her think through all of the different things that she didn't understand and was trying to figure out and navigate. And over, I'd come home from these coffee dates and I just felt so much purpose and so much meaning. And I loved helping parents kind of figure out what their child needed, but most importantly, to help these parents see that even though their child has been diagnosed with a learning difference, it's not a black mark, it's not a scarlet letter. These are students who have so many strengths. And it was, from my perspective, so rewarding and so meaningful. So at that point, I was really giving thought to whether or not I wanted to transition. And I myself went to boarding school and was really active in the boarding school I had gone to. And I was serving on our board of trustees and really kind of at a crossroads in my career about whether or not I wanted to transition and work at a school, work in admissions, work in advancement. And so I started doing information interviews with different admissions directors, and a number of them kept saying, you really should go into consulting. Like, you would be an excellent educational consultant. And so it was at that point that I started to research it. And I literally, I'm probably embarrassed to say this, but I literally went on to the internet and put in consulting and then education. And then I found IECA, which is our professional association for independent educational consultants. And there was a meeting that was coming up happening in Boston. And I was just determined and I was going to go no matter what it took to pull that off. And so I just started learning more and made that transition. And my boss at the time was really, really supportive in terms of my making this transition. So that's how I got started.
That's a wonderful story because it found you, sort of like you were led there by things that really meant a lot to you. And I relate to that because I've spent my whole career in independent schools doing a lot of different things. And I never planned to go into admission. And I sort of fell into it. And for the same reasons, because I really love working closely with families and I love helping families find solutions and find a way to have their children thrive. And I've done admission at 3 different schools, actually. And what I want to say to families from the admission point of view is I feel as though, in a sense, I'm a consultant as well. If anyone ever said I was a salesperson, I think I would just have to quit because that's just not who I am. Even though you might think admission is selling the school, but for me, it's really working with a family. And if I don't think Eagle Hill is the right school, then I will refer a family to you. I will refer a family to another school that I think is a really good school. And I think that when families encounter admission offices, the admission office should really reflect the culture of the school, the philosophy of the school, hopefully the transparency. And so that's how I feel. So I never want families to feel that if they contacted me or my colleagues here at Eagle Hill, there would ever be any pressure. So we always feel like we're trying to do the same thing you're trying to do. And that's how you and I work together. And we've worked together now for a long time, even when I was not at Eagle Hill and learning about what educational consultants do. But now at Eagle Hill, 40% of our students have worked with an educational consultant. Our podcast today is not just to talk about educational consulting, but I do think that it's an amazing resource that a lot of families just don't really know about. And they're doing Google searches, they're trying to figure this out on their own. And then they get these testing reports that are 50 pages long, and they're trying to understand what all of this means and how does a school promise to do these things to help, and will they be able to do those things? So maybe one other thing is just tell us a little bit about the scope of your firm. Who are the families and the students that you work with?
So our firm specializes in just school placements. So when we work with families, we're working with students who are pre-kindergarten all the way up through a postgraduate. We will work with some families that are their students that we had placed previously into their schools, but their students are aging up and getting ready for the college admissions process. So we're not doing traditional college admissions, but helping them think in terms of the steps to college, accommodations, what do they need to be doing in terms of their testing and that readiness for eligibility for accommodations at the college level. Some kids aren't ready for a traditional college program, but they might need more of a transitional college support program. But I would say the bulk of the students that we work with are those students that are elementary through the high school age. And the way in which we're working with families is we start off with what we call a parent strategy session, and we're working with them in that session to really gauge what it is they're looking for and to determine if we're the best fit for them, or is what they really need maybe more of an advocate or an attorney. Are they even looking for placement at this point, or do they need help more from a thought partnership perspective? But most of our families are at the onset hiring us for placement purposes. And a big part of what I do is a lot of parent coaching. And part of how we're doing that is to take whatever it is that exists in terms of the student's file and testing and who the student is, interests, strengths, all that sort of good stuff, and start to kind of tease out what is the root issue or issues that are going on. So I tend to come at things very much from a systems perspective and looking at what are all the different systems that are at play and what's the interconnectedness, because a lot of times this is new. They've maybe just got a new diagnosis, or they have been trying to kind of figure things out for however many years and are just at a point of exhaustion and frustration and know the public school isn't going to be the best fit. So they're looking for a private school placement, but to help them see what the possibilities are. In order to be able to do that, we really have to understand what it is that's going on. So the majority of the students that we work with are students who are really bright, accomplished, successful. A lot of these students who do learn differently are kids, as you and I know so well, who have so many strengths, and yet they're not maybe feeling that. Their parents may be feeling frustrated or feeling as though they're procrastinating or lazy or whatever it is. So that's where the coaching comes in, is to just really help the parents understand what it is that's going on, what's the interplay between the different behaviors that are being exhibited, and also the reconciling kind of that cognitive profile of the student. And again, back to the strengths and helping them find what the possibilities are. And for many of the families, those possibilities are in private schools. And in particular, a lot of the boarding schools have just such wonderful support for students with learning differences.
Yeah, it's so funny. I don't know. Do you know much about functional medicine?
Well, not much. I know some.
In my spare time, I love to listen to other podcasts on health and functional medicine. And you just really described what functional medicine does. They don't just look at, oh, you have this condition or disease. They look at what the root cause is. They do a
Yeah.
dive on everything. And that's sort of what you're doing. You're not just looking and saying, oh, this student doesn't read well. You're doing a deep dive through everything. And then you are able to explain it to families in a way that allows them to understand and embrace and be actually excited about the possibilities. And there aren't that many schools that are able to do what we're talking about, what Eagle Hill does, and other schools that are able to work really well with kids who learn differently. There aren't that many schools, and particularly in certain parts of the country, there aren't many schools. We have a lot of kids who come to us from California, who come to us from other parts of the US and abroad. And I would say most of the families that I speak to, no matter where they're coming from, they're really nervous about the boarding aspect. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about that. I know you went to boarding school yourself, but how does boarding school work for students that learn differently or students in general?
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you raised that around the functional medicine, because I even think back on one of my own kids and so many of the younger students that come to us, and there's a lot at play. And when parents tell me some of the symptoms that they're seeing in their kids, for example, constipation, stomach aches, tummy aches, like things like that, and they're going to see a GI doctor and chasing down this rabbit hole. And in reality, what's really going on is the anxiety that's at play, because as the students getting older, they're aware that they're so different and feeling different, and the anxiety is impacting the GI system. And it's all so connected, and it's amazing. I was just on a call with a dad prior to this time with you, and I was saying to him just that I love the transformation that I see in the kids that we work with. It's so purposeful and meaningful, and it's just one of the best parts of the work that we do. I'm sure you feel it too, because the kid that you interview is so different than the student who graduates from your school.
You are so right, Elizabeth, especially at this time of year, because we have our graduation in 2 weeks. And I look at these seniors, many of them I worked with when they were coming in 8th grade, came in 9th grade or 10th grade, it doesn't matter. And I look at them and I literally can't believe the transformation that I see. And you mentioned your own children, and you know that I have two children who both have dyslexia, but my younger daughter also had ADHD and dyscalculia. And I didn't need to go to an educational consultant because I had so many people that I knew that could help and guide me. And I found Eagle Hill for Sophie, for my daughter. And that's really why I ended up coming here. And I watched my own child transform right in front of me at this school, and I'm watching her in college in a very challenging nursing program. And I just keep pinching myself because I just never dreamed that it would be anything like that would be not only be possible for her, but that she would have the confidence to actually go for it and do it. And I do think that she boarded here as well. She was both a day and a boarding student here. And I would say, my husband and I always say that the boarding is the piece we feel was equally valuable to everything else that happened. So I'm anxious to hear your perspective on working with families around boarding school.
Yeah, there's so many reasons why I think boarding school is beneficial for a student. And I guess one of the areas that I would probably start is, I think the way that boarding school is structured is there's so much predictability in the schedule, and there's so much structure. And I think that in and of itself, it supports all learners, but in particular supports students who do learn differently, whether they have ADD or not as part of that profile. But that predictability in terms of routine, expectations, it really plays to teaching these kids and helping them discover the skills and strategies that are going to work for them. And just that kind of consistent routine, I think, really helps kids. Another area that I would say from a boarding school's perspective, and especially a school like Eagle Hill, where you have so many similar learners, is just that school culture it's that understanding of who they are as learners, how they learn best. It is embedded throughout everything that you guys do. And that for kids who have, wherever they were before, felt different or felt like an outlier, or felt like they didn't fit in or couldn't find success because their teachers didn't understand them. When you get into a boarding school environment where you're being taught by teachers who are specialized in working with students with that, for example, dyslexic profile, it's so powerful for these kids because they feel understood for the first time. They can find their voice, they can gain that confidence and that self-esteem. And I think that's huge. I tell parents, your child might have anxiety, and I'm not saying that anxiety is going to go away when they go to boarding school, but what you're going to find is it's going to kind of fall into the background. It's going to fall to the wayside because they're going to feel comfortable. They're going to feel that they have friends again. They're finding their tribe. They're kids who are like them, and they're in a place where they are understood. understood. And that anxiety just kind of fades into the background and they're accessible again. They're engaged. And that's the other way that I would say that I think boarding schools really differentiate themselves from certainly public schools, and to some extent, even the private day schools, is just that real opportunity for kind of high interest academics and activities. And what I mean by that is it's along the lines of the opportunity in the evening to go and, for example, work in the art studio because you're working on your art portfolio. And if you're in a day school or you're in a public school, you don't have that opportunity during evening study hall. And so higher interest, higher attention. And it gets back to kind of that structure, but also the quality of the overall experience the students having. I could go on too, I really could. But I would say one of the other areas is just the overall quality of life that happens. And I was talking about this the other day with a parent. Right now, when a student is at home in their local school and they're struggling, the parents are wearing so many hats. They're the tutor, they're the executive functioning coach, they're the chauffeur driving to all the different tutoring sessions and speech and language sessions. And they're trying to be the parent and they're the cook and dinner has to be ready at whatever time. And there's so many different hats that a parent's wearing. And when a student is in boarding school, I tell parents, don't view it that you're sending your student away. I think a lot of parents view it through that lens. And I really encourage parents to reframe how they view it. Look at it through a wider angle lens. And you're not sending your kid away. You're providing them with an opportunity. And one of the ways that I see that it impacts families more than anything is just that overall quality of life, not just for the student, but for, again, back to the whole family system. Because these are kids who you now, as the parent, you put on just that mom hat or that dad hat because you're not having to chauffeur, you're not having to provide the tutoring and executive functioning support. And everyone, the relationship just improves across the whole family system. And I could go on. If you want me to name more reasons, I can, but I tend to ramble. So I'll stop there.
I think you're really highlighting so many things that resonate with me. How many families that have come to me and said so many things like, I finally have my child back. The lightness of being that returns both for the student and for the parents, and that normalcy, that feeling of like we're a family again. I certainly can relate to that as well. There are a lot of pain points for families who are considering this option. When you mentioned that feeling of I'm sending my child away. And I think that my advice to parents is always, this might not be what your first choice, but don't rule it out. Give it a chance, at least go and look. There's so much fear, I think, for people. And so I was curious about how you coach parents around just the fear of what is it that they're most afraid of? And then how do you help them develop trust? Because I think a lot of parents have PTSD, especially coming out of a system is just the way it is. A lot of parents who come in sometimes to boarding schools, they're used to being in battle mode. They're used to being not trusting. They're used to expecting not to know when something's going wrong and to be blindsided. They're expecting the worst, actually. I just said a lot, but if there's anything in there that you can pick up on to say how you work with parents would be interesting.
That's a really good question because I think many parents have hesitations about boarding school. And I do find that the families where maybe one of the parents has attended a boarding school, there's less hesitation, but in some ways there's more resistance from the other parent. And again, it's what is that point of resistance and trying to kind of understand it from that systems perspective. I try to look at it and say, what's the block or the blockade that's happening and what can I do to help kind of coach and provide more information to lessen that resistance? And a lot depends, obviously, and each family is different and that point of resistance may be different. So for example, one family, they might be afraid of the fear of the unknown because boarding school is unfamiliar to both parents and it's a new concept and they hadn't even thought about it. So that might be the point of resistance or hesitation versus another family. I find a lot of families are really worried. You were saying they've kind of been warriors and it's too much of a jump for their child. Like they're worried that they're not going to be with the child to kind of provide the scaffolding and support. And this is going to be too much of a jump for them. And then there's certainly parents that have the concern around the lack of oversight at a boarding school. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to be separated from my child because what if they have trouble brushing their teeth and taking care of themselves? And so it's understanding what is that point of resistance. And so once I get a better sense of that from just my ongoing working with the families and kind of building that relationship as I get to know the families that are clients of mine, I then work with my admissions partners to really help them understand what it is that might be that point of resistance. And I think at my firm, we're really known for being very transparent and there are no pretenses and there's no points of shame or embarrassment. And I tell parents that I'm not replacing you. I'm not replacing your voice. What I'm doing is I'm a facilitator of a process here, and I'm opening up our dialogue and our conversations for a really collaborative process. And so in doing so, I want you as my admissions colleague to understand where there's maybe fear or concern or hesitation. And so one of the ways that I think it's really helpful to the families to understand and kind of lessen that concern or fear is by providing information and data. And so the more that we can partner together to make sure the parents have as much opportunity for conversations with whomever is going to be helpful for them, that alone is so powerful for a family. And then they need to move forward and continue to talk with whoever they need to talk to understand and get to that point of comfort.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love working with consultants, but every consultant is also a little bit different. I have such a high level of trust with you. And we also pride ourselves on being really transparent here too. And I know that when you work with a family, you're not just going to be recommending Eagle Hill, you're going to be putting together a list for families, and then the family will be visiting multiple schools. And that's great. That's what families really should be doing. And when you're working with a family and the family is thinking about boarding school and you're putting together that list, how do you know when do you put Eagle Hill on the list versus other boarding schools that have support? Because there are differences between a school like Eagle Hill, which really is expert in working with students that learn differently, versus boarding schools that have a certain percentage of the population that might learn differently, and they would provide supports more in a silo. And we cross over with those schools quite a bit, but maybe to help families understand how you think of Eagle Hill, maybe just giving families a little bit of a sense of that piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, again, another really good question because every family is obviously different. But I think from my perspective, a really helpful way that we start is I tell parents I'm going to cast the net wide and we're going to consider a number of different types of school. But part of what I'm hoping is that by having parents consider and get to know schools of varying, I'm going to say profiles, but levels of support in this sample that we're talking about is going to help them rule in or rule out other schools. And so the way in which we work is we put together schools and we have what we call our green schools, our yellow schools, and our red schools. So almost a very simplistic traffic light analogy, but it really works. And the reason being is the green schools are the ones that I think are going to be the best fits. And here are the reasons why I think they're the best fits. And then our yellow ones are going to be good fits, but maybe it's too far away geographically, or maybe it's single gender and you want co-ed or whatever the reasons are. But I want parents to know kind of the breadth of what's available. And then from there, moving forward, we really pretty quickly start to hone in on what our green schools are that we're looking at that I think are really good fits. But what I'm doing in that process is helping parents to understand the different nuances. And there are indeed, as you and I know, nuances between the schools, because parents can do a Google internet research and see and find schools. But when you really start to kind of get much deeper below the surface, there are differences in learning support from school to school, for example, and what that school's philosophy is around, for example, discipline. If kids get into trouble, what's the philosophy? That can really vary at schools. Or what is the culture around, for example, the residential life? You guys have a fantastic residential life structure because your residential life staff are full-time. Like they are there to be just doing residential life support for these kids who so need it. And they don't therefore have what I think sometimes can happen at other schools, some of the fatigue that comes with wearing a lot of different hats. And so there are nuances and certainly significant differences among the schools. And so as I take parents through that process, really helping them to understand those differences and point them out. But I always like to say to people will get my name and they're interested in learning about becoming an educational consultant. And one of the things I feel fortunate because early in my career, most of my career was working in consulting and I worked more for a management strategy firm. But a lot of what I did before is stuff that I do now. I worked with assessments. I'm now working with educational assessments. I'm a certified coach. I'm now doing parent coaching. I worked with curriculum. I have my master's in education. I'm now working and looking at schools and their curriculum and what are those curriculum paths and that sort of thing. But one of the things I learned early on in my career is that a really good consultant doesn't tell. We don't dictate. A good consultant, if I'm doing a good job, I'm really good at asking questions questions. And I know I want to get parents from point A to point B, but I can't tell them I want to get them from point A to point B. I need to ask good questions so that they will find their way to point B, and it's on their own kind of momentum that they're getting there. But in doing so, the way we've gotten there together is by unearthing through the different questions what the concerns, the hesitations, the areas of interest are, to help parents really understand and get to know a school so they can get to that point where we all as parents have that gut where we're like, this is the school for my child. And that's great. It happens. If I'm doing a good job, that always happens. But I've been told I'm kind of that hoarse whisperer, if you will, of when I meet kids, I'm just like, this is the school for them. But I can't tell the parents that. I need them to figure that out on their own.
That is such a great way to put it too. And because there's so much intuition, I think, that goes into this work, and good listening and empathy and being able to put yourself in another person's shoes. And, and I had that experience yesterday with a family, and they visited, and it was just clear to all of us that this was the school for this family, because it's not just a decision about your child. It's also about the family and hoping that the family's values match up with the school's values and everything aligns. And that's why when you go to visit, I always tell students, listen to your gut, listen to your heart. I mean, that sounds really corny, but it is really true and important. And I think for families too, the clock does start to tick, because when you're in elementary school and you just start wondering, maybe there's certain clues about things that are going on, and then you hit middle school, and then like you said, the older the student gets, that anxiety does start to come in so many cases. Things can manifest in, like you said, in so many different ways. And then we have sometimes families that don't find us until their child is going to be an 11th or a 12th grader. And certainly we do work with 11th graders sometimes, but I always, in a lot of cases, wish that, we could have had that student for longer. And because it's hard to, once you're launched out of high school, it's hard to gather and to get to know yourself. And it can really change the trajectory of your life. I mean, and to be really blunt about it, it can really change the trajectory. I mean, I'm a big believer in confidence as one of the main ingredients that students need. I know it was true for my own daughter, but something else I was wondering if you could talk about is for families who have a child who may be struggling or has not had the best experience in school, what do you think the main ingredients are for success for students who learn differently? Is it learning math or, being able to write? Of course, all those things are important, but what are the main ingredients that you think students who learn differently really need to have?
I always tell parents that I want them to think about the here and now, but I also want them to be thinking about the future. And so when they're looking at a school, what does that runway look like? Is it too short of a runway? Is it long enough of a runway? But how is the school going to prepare them for wherever they might be going next? And another thing I tell parents is by the time kids get out of middle school, like my hope is that the parents got that diagnostic clarity around their students' learning profile, because when kids are going off into the high school years, they really need to be able to understand their learning profile themselves, and they need to be able to advocate for themselves and ask for things. But most importantly, they need to be in a place where they can try things to figure out on their own if they're going to work for them or not. Not a teacher or a tutor or a learning specialist telling them, you have to use this, reader, this note-taking app or whatever it is. But the students need to figure out for themselves, this works for me, or I like the recorded voice on Audible versus learning at like whatever it is that's going to work for a student, versus someone telling them they have to use something. Because when, as you and I know so well, when these students go off to college and they have learning differences and they're approved for accommodations, there's no 504 plan, there's no IEP in college. They have to figure it out themselves, and they have to get approved for accommodations themselves, and they have to be advocating themselves. And so if when they're in their high school years and they don't have that opportunity to do that, then that's when we get the calls from kids who are falling flat on their face and things are really not going well. And so back to your question around kind of what is it that kind of talks to that success, I feel that it's having students be in an educational environment in a school where they have those small class sizes, where they can access the teachers for help trying to kind of tweak or learn whatever strategy, tool, assistive tech app, whatever it it is they're trying to kind of use that's going to help them. It's the opportunity for just that overall access for support and knowing who, I like to refer to it as who's their rock, like who's their person, who's their go-to person, so that when they're feeling frustrated, scared, whatever that feeling is, they know they have that person. Because again, it comes back to that self-confidence and that success. And if they can start to internalize that and advocate for themselves, then they will rock. They will be so great in college, like you were talking about with your daughter. But if they don't have those opportunities, and that's again where I feel like the boarding schools and the specialized boarding schools really provide that opportunity, I just feel so conducive to helping diverse learners thrive. And it's just really kind of built into the way that boarding schools that are more specialized support that diverse learner.
You know, you made me laugh when you were talking about college, because the colleges really don't even want to talk to the parents, right? I mean,
not at all.
It is like all of a sudden this giant iron door is like slamming shut.
Yes.
And you are absolutely correct. If the student is not able to navigate, that is when really and truly they do fall. And it's really difficult. And sometimes the parents don't even know that they're falling because,
yes, because you don't get grades, you don't get report cards, you
don't know.
unless
Right.
your students sharing, you have no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless they're willing to give you their login for their portal so that you can spy on them, then you are not going to know what is happening. So I definitely agree. And that's why my daughter is absolutely being successful, because she is I don't know what the word is, like Tasmanian devil when it comes to being in the learning center, asking for the help, knowing how to get, because there are so many accommodations you can get in college.
Yes.
You know, literally from residential, do you need a single? Do you preferential housing, early registration for classes that are in the morning and not in the afternoon, you know, so you'll never have to have a Friday at 4 o'clock. There's coaching available in so many schools. And it's funny, we categorize colleges in 3 different buckets. We don't do the colors, but we do, you know, basic support, coordinated support, and comprehensive support, you know, and that really helps families. And so the other really cool thing about going to a boarding school that is specialized is the college counseling department. They know the schools and they know what supports, and then they know what supports the student will need, because it's pretty easy, actually. I mean, maybe you'll disagree with this, but it can be easy to get accepted into a college, you know, depending on certain things, but that doesn't mean you're going to be successful at that college. And so I know that we track not only our acceptances, but we track how well the students are doing, and do they matriculate? Do they stay at those schools? And this year we have a young woman who's going to be going to Georgetown next year, right? Which is obviously a school that isn't going to have the same kinds of supports as a school like a Dean or a Mitchell or a Curry. And even schools like Northeastern, they have great supports. So you might not even know that, but our college counselors will know that. That was another factor for me with my daughter. I thought that her college outcome would be so much better coming out of a school where people knew her, and also the college counseling department knew kind of how to guide her.
Yes. Well, now so many colleges are test optional too. And I think that is the required standardized entrance testing, the ACT or the SAT for a lot of kids with learning differences, even with accommodations on it. It is challenging for the kids, but these are kids who are so hardworking. I mean, one of the, I think, hallmark traits of a lot of kids who have had to work twice as hard is just the tenacity and the persistence is such a part of their profile. And so academically, they can do really well. And again, if they understand who they are as a learner and what they need, and they've learned to advocate for themselves, then the sky's the limit. Like you're saying, your student who's graduating, going to Georgetown or whatever school, there's so many wonderful colleges out there for the kids. But if they don't have, again, those skills and strategies and that ability to advocate and understand self moving forward, then that's where it can fall apart, because there's much less structure, as we know, at the college level. And the opportunity to kind of not find your rock and not know who your go-to person is really different at college. It's certainly something that it's a different landscape, but the wonderful thing is, like I said, there's so many great colleges out there and so many different sizes and support programs. And it gets back to kind of that runway analogy and kind of what is a student ready for? And I always say to parents, I think oftentimes we've been through so much and needed to navigate so much. And it's that fear again of the unknown and fear that you don't want to push your kid too much. And yet there's a lot of kind of keeping up with the Joneses and all that sort of stuff. But it's okay to push a little bit, but you want it to be an environment where your student is going to feel comfortable. And that social emotional fit, from my perspective, is one of the most important important things, because if a student doesn't feel comfortable and doesn't feel as though they can find their tribe and their friends, it doesn't matter how challenging or less rigorous the academics are, it's not going to be a match.
You are 100% correct. And that's a great way to end our time, because that really sums it up. The fit is everything, and the social emotional piece. And like you said, the residential piece, where a lot of the social emotional happens, is so incredibly valuable.
So valuable.
If families want to find you or work with you or learn more about consulting, they know where to find me. And I hope that families will feel free to contact me if they want to learn more about Eagle Hill, but also just in general as a professional. But how would they best contact you?
Absolutely. So we have a wonderful website, halleducationalresources.com. We're based in the greater Boston area, but we work with families worldwide, so from all around. And then I'm also on LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn is I'm Elizabeth Hall. And we also have a Facebook page, Hall Educational Resources, and on Instagram. But truth be told, most of our kind of social media, if you will, activity is more along the lines of LinkedIn. And I have a wonderful newsletter that we put out each week with lots of different various topics and things. I try to be educational and informative and help parents, but the best way is probably through our website and our contact form.
Great. And I just read you just published one yesterday. It was about boarding schools, right? Like the top.
It was a top 10. I forget the exact title of it, but the top 10 things to look for when working with an educational consultant. But I do have one on boarding schools too. So yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how you churn out all that content, but you are amazing. So good job. Well, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you today. And I know we'll be seeing each other again soon in person. And until then, be well. And thanks again for being with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always so fun to catch up with you.
I know. Same. All right. Bye, everybody.